Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Cubstart Web. This is lecture 3, and today we'll be learning about some JavaScript. Okay, so just as a quick recap, this is kind of the file structure that we have so far. So far we've learned about the index.html file. That's like the structure of our website. We've learned about styles.css, which is like how we make it look pretty. And now we're going to be learning about our JavaScript file. Okay. So again, just recapping some stuff. This is what the Gmail page would look like if we had no CSS, no JavaScript. Very ugly, it's very unstyled, but the structure exists. Now, this is what the Gmail page would look like with the CSS. So as you can tell, it looks kind of exactly how we would picture the CSS page, but it's not complete because we don't have JavaScript. So without JavaScript, this page is just static. So all of the buttons that we're used to usually pressing, all the actions that we can usually do on this page are no longer doable. So this is where JavaScript comes in. It does a lot of the heavy lifting in a website. So like on the server side, these questions, how did all the emails load? How does Gmail know who I am? How am I shown as active when I'm online? JavaScript answers all those questions. Same with the client side. How do I switch between inboxes? How do I initiate a search through the search bar? How can I delete an email? All of this JavaScript handles. And for the first half of this class, we're just going to be focusing on the client side. So this is the front end of the JavaScript. Okay, so let's look at a quick example. So let's say you want to delete an email. Well, the user will click the trash icon to delete it. And this tells the server to delete the email from the database. And then it checks if it's been deleted successfully. If it has, it'll remove the email. And if it doesn't, it'll display an error message. This is all JavaScript. This is all done by JavaScript. And without it, we would not be able to do any of these actions. Okay, so now let's actually jump into how we can code in JavaScript. Okay, so first of all, what is JavaScript? Well, JavaScript is a scripting language and it's interpreted by the browsers, so no compilation step needed. Um, the most important part is that it allows you to modify the DOM dynamically. Okay, so a good way to think about it, if we look at this picture over here, HTML is like the skeleton of the human body, it's the structure. CSS is what makes it look like how it's supposed to on the outside. And JavaScript is like the muscles, so like how the muscles allow us to move and do actions. JS allows the website to be dynamic. Okay. So, where do we put the JS code? Well, like the CSS file, we put our JS file in a separate one. So we do the name.js. And to integrate it into the HTML, we put this script tag right here at the bottom of our HTML file. So, why do we put it at the bottom though? We want to make sure that all the HTML elements are rendered before we try to run anything in the JS because JS is heavily reliant on the HTML elements. So if we put it at the top and then we try to run the JS file, we could get errors because the HTML elements may not be rendered yet. So we want to just ensure that everything is loaded first before we run any of the JS, hence it being at the bottom. Okay, so you can see here that JavaScript can be run anywhere. So any like browser at all can be a console for you to run JavaScript. So if we go to another tab here, we press right click and we inspect, and then we get all of this code for our browser. If we press this console button right here, we can type whatever we want. So let's say I do console.log, hello, and it types hello right there. So if you ever need to run some JavaScript pretty quick, you can always do it in the console of any browser. Let's go back here. Okay. And as you can see, this is what I just did. So the most basic thing we can learn how to print on a console. It's basically like if you took Python, we always did print. In JavaScript, it's console.log, and then the value you want to print. You can see you can also do multiple values by putting commas in between. So very similar to other languages, just a change in the name. Okay, declaring variables. So there's a couple way to declare variables using different keywords. Okay, so the most common one and the one you'll use the most often is going to be let. So if you want to just make a variable that you want to have the ability to reassign later, then you can use let before the variable name and then equal and then whatever you want it to set it equal to. Another one is const. So let's say you have a variable that you want to only be one value ever, then you can make it const and then you can never reassign that value. Lastly is var. So var is technically an option, but we don't want to use it because it can result in a lot of bugs in the future. I'll go into more depth in it in a bit, but just know that you should not be using var. Okay, let's look into let a little more. So like I said, let allows you to reassign the variables. You can see here, we set greeting equal to say hi, and then we could change it to say hello instead right after, and no errors at all. Another important feature is that it's block scoped. So you can see here, we create hello in the if statement, but then once we exit the if statement, hello no longer exists, which means it only exists inside the curly brackets that it was created in. So if we tried to console.log hello outside of the if statement, we would get an error saying that hello is not defined. Okay, let's talk more about const. Like I said before, it's not reassignable. So you can see if we try to reassign greeting here to say hello instead, we get an error because it's a const variable. And like let, it's also block scoped. Okay, finally, let's look at var. So the reason we don't want to use var is because it's what we call globally or function scoped, which means that even if you create it inside of a block, you can use it outside of that block. So if you create it in an if statement, you can use it anywhere else inside of your program. And this, we just don't want to use consistently throughout our code because it can cause weird, hard to track errors that could really mess up our program if we have, like, let's say hundreds and hundreds of lines. So we want to avoid using var basically at all costs. Okay, let's talk some primitive types. So there's 5 here. The first one is number. If you're used to like Python or Java, you know that there's usually int or float, but in JavaScript, we just have numbers. So this includes all integers and all floats or doubles. Second one we have is string, basically anything inside of quotes. It could be double quotes or single quotes, but you can have anything you want, any character possible, just inside quotes. That means the string. Third is Boolean. It can only be true or false. And then there's null, which just means it's an empty value, basically is nothing. It's like the code equivalent of nothing. Um, and then there's undefined, which is when, let's say, you create a variable. So let's say you do like let hello, and then you don't set it equal to something. That would mean that the variable is undefined. And then everything else is an object. But you don't have to worry too much about that. Okay. Another type are arrays and lists. So if you want to store multiple items together, then you can use a list. to hold them all. So you can see the syntax for that is we create a variable like any other. We do let the name of the list equal sign, and we use square brackets for arrays, okay? And then you can separate all the values in the square brackets by commas. You can see you can even create an array with multiple different types, so it doesn't have to be all strings or all numbers. It can be booleans, strings, numbers, whatever you want. If you want to access a specific value from this list, you can do the name of the list, square brackets, and then the index. And always remember that indices start at 0. So, like, let's say we want to get bears, that's going to be index 1 because it starts from go, which is 0, and then it goes 1 and 2. Okay, so always remember indices start at 0. Okay. If you want to set values in the list, you use the same syntax, but then you set that equal to a new thing. So you can see we do the same thing. We do the name of the list, bracket, the index, and then set it equal to whatever you want. Okay. There are also some methods, some built-in methods that we can use for arrays that just make our life a little easier. So you can see it's always the dot notation. You do the name of the list, dot, the method, and then parentheses, okay? So for push, that's going to add a value to the end of the list. You can see we did push 1, and that adds 1 to the end of our list. Pop deletes the last element from our list. Okay, sort sorts it in ascending order, so from least to greatest, basically. And then includes checks if a certain value is in our list. So if it is in our list, it returns true, and if it's not, it returns false. Okay, the last type we're going to talk about are objects. So if you've done Python, it's very similar to like a dictionary or a map. We have a set of keys and it corresponds to a set of values. Values can be anything you want, it can be primitives, functions, lists, other objects, but keys have to be strings or symbols, and the strings and symbols are actually interchangeable. Um, so you can see here the way that we initialize it. We create a variable, once again, like any other, and we use curly brackets, okay? And you can see that each key and value are separated by colons, and then each total pair are separated by commas. You can see here in this case, our keys are symbols, the symbols A and B. So if you want to access one of the values corresponding to these keys, you can use dot notation. So you can see here we did the name of the object, dot, and then the name of the key. And in this case, this is how we access it using the symbol notation. But we can also access, we can also access things using quotes. So, kind of like how we did it for the list, we do the name of the object, square brackets, and then the name of the key. But in this case, we use quotes because it's the string version. And you can also change things using that, and you can just access the value there using that. So you can see here, you can either use dot notation or bracket notation to access values in our object. Okay, let's do a little check-in. I know you're at home, not in a classroom, but if you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out the types for each, and then we can go through it together. Okay, so now that you've unpaused the video, let's go through all the types, okay? So these are the answers. Okay, so number 1, okay, even though it says true, it's going to be a string because we have those quotes. 2 is a Boolean because there's no strings and it's a false. 3 is a number because it's a number. 4 is a string. 5 is a string, even though there's a number inside of it, there's quotes, which means it's still a string. 6 is a list, and 7 is an object. Okay, hope you did well on that, and move on. Okay, so now let's talk about functions, the really important part of JavaScript. Let's say you have like a couple lines of code in your program that you keep copy and pasting using over and over. Well, that's not a very good use of your time. So instead of doing that, you can use a function. So you can use the syntax right here. You use the function keyword, and then you do the name of the function, any arguments you pass in, and then whatever you want to do inside of these curly brackets. So the whole point of making functions is that instead of writing the same, like maybe 3 or 4 lines of code over and over again in your program, you can just call your function instead, which is a lot less work. Okay? And just overall helps reduce repetition in your code. So you can see this example here. We have this function magic, it returns this expression, and instead of writing this expression 3 times over again, we just call magic each line. And you can see for the arguments are the data that you pass into the function. So you can see on these lines, the first line we passed 5 into this function. So then 5 gets transported into num, it gets stored in num. And now every time we use num inside of our function, um, we're actually using the number we passed in, which is 5 in this case. Okay, so we can also use this arrow function syntax. It's just a shorter way to write our functions, at least for this scope, at least for the scope of this class. The two are pretty much the same, but just know that you are also able to write functions like this, where you store it kind of like how you create a variable. You do const, the name of the function, equal, and then the arguments, and then use this little symbol, the equal sign in the bracket right here to create the function. But just know again, for the scope of this class, these two are pretty much the same. Um, and if you really want, if you have one argument, you don't have to put parentheses around them. Okay, so when would you even use this notation? What's the purpose? So you can see here on this top example, when we call this find function, we call it with an argument that is also a function, this helper function. So we can, if we want, create this function above and then call find with the helper function stored in here. But we can also shorten it all to one line. So you can see we can use this arrow function notation without ever storing it in a variable. So if you look here, instead of storing this function in a variable and then calling find with that variable name, instead we just put the body of our function inside of the find call. So you can see here, we never set it equal to a variable name. We just did the argument, the arrow, and then the body of our function. And this works when we just have a really short one-line function that we only want to use once, and then we can do this, and we then never have to actually store it in any variable. Okay, so let's talk about some control flow, some conditional loops functions. First one is an if statement. So it allows you to execute code based on certain conditions. You can see we have 3 different ones. We have if, else if, and else. So you can have as many else ifs as you want, but it always has to start with an if, and it can end with an else. It doesn't have to end with an else, but the else always has to be at the very end. So it's if, any amount of else ifs you want, and an else at the end. Okay? The way it works is, let's say we go to the if, we check this condition 1. If it's true, then we go inside the if statement and we ignore any else ifs or else after it. If it's false, then we keep going to the different else ifs and elses, or the different else ifs until we find a condition that is true. If all the conditions are false, then we enter the else. Okay, so then the question is, what is a true value? Okay, the easier question to ask though is what is a false value? So false values are confined to this list of things. So false, zero, null, undefined, empty quotes, empty brackets, and NaN. Okay, so these are all the false values that we can have. That means that anything else is true. Okay, so if this condition results in any of these false values here, then we don't enter that statement. Once we find a true value, we enter that statement and we ignore the rest. Okay? Okay. So this is really important because we don't want to mess this up. So the difference between loose and strict equality operators. So the loose equality operators are the double equal sign and the exclamation mark equal sign. Okay? So these don't compare value types, they only compare the values, okay? So for example, if it compared true and one, well, technically those are both true in terms of like Boolean values. So then that would result in true. Another example, if we compare six, the number, and six, the string, that would also result in true, which we don't usually want, okay? We usually want to make sure that we compare the type of the object and the value, which is why we use the strict equality operators, the triple equal sign, and the not, and then two equal signs, okay? So this ensures that we check the type and the value. So you can see here now, when we compare true and one, it results in false. When we check the number six and the string six, that also returns false. Okay. Okay. Another way we can add to our conditions is by using and or. So let's say we want to check multiple conditions in one if statement, then we can combine them using these two symbols. So and is the double equal sign, and this is basically saying we need both conditions to be true for the whole to be true. Okay, so the way it works is it either evaluates to the first false value or the last value if there's no false values. So let me show you the example so you understand better. Okay, so you can see here if we do true and one, true is a true value, one is a one value. There were no false values, which means that it evaluates to the last value, which is one. In this case, both zero and false are false values, but this expression evaluates to zero because it finds the first false value. Okay? Or is the opposite. Or is basically saying we just want either of these conditions to be true. Only one of these conditions need to be true. So this one evaluates to either the first true value or the last value if there are no true values. Okay, so you can see here, there's the two conditions are true and false. It evaluates to true because it's the first true value it found. In this case, checking if 5 is equal to 6, that is false, but 1 plus 1 equal to is true. So then that results in true because that's the first true value that I found. Okay? Okay, while loops. So basically while loops are used to run a block of code over and over again as long as a certain condition is true. Once the condition is false, then we exit the loop and stop executing the code inside. So you can see here, while this condition here is true, it'll keep console.logging condition true. Once the condition becomes false, then it exits and it prints condition false. Okay? Now, for loops. For loops are like a specific version of a while loop. So we use for loops when we want to run something for a specific number of times. So let's say you know you want to print numbers 0 through n minus 1, or you want to iterate through every value in a list, which has a specific number of values. Then we want to use a for loop because we know before running it how many times we want to loop. So you can see the structure. There's three parts to the structure. There's the initialization. So you can see we have this, what we call an index variable. Um, we initialize the index variable and started at the value we wanted to start at. So for this one, we started at 0. And then we have the condition, which is the condition that has to be true for the for loop to continue moving on. And we have the increment, which increases the index variable each loop. Okay. And so it'll keep running, and each loop of the for loop, it'll increase I by 1 until I is no longer less than n. Okay. Now, this is a more specific version of that for loop. It's called a for of loop. So let's say we want to loop through an iterable, which is like an array, a map, something like that. Then we can use the shorthand syntax to directly access the elements instead of having to use the indices. So this is the syntax. We do for const a variable name. In this case, it's cat of, and then the name of the list. In this case, it's a list of cats. So for the regular for loop, we had the I, which is the index 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. But in this case, our variable is literally the elements in our list. So in this case, cat would be lion first, and then it would be tiger. So no indices used, just the actual elements. Okay, some math operators. We have just like the regular ones, plus, minus, multiplication, division. We also have power. So if you want to raise something to the power of something, you can do the base, 2 asterisks, and then the exponent. We also have modulo, which is remainder. So like, let's say you do 7 divided by 3, the remainder of that operation is 1, which is what modulo is. So you do the dividend and then modulo the divisor, and you get the remainder. So you can see here, 7 modulo 3, that would be equal to 1. Okay. And then we have some built-in methods that helps us handle strings. So we can go through this list. It's just split, which splits the string into an array of substrings. And then we have includes, which checks if a string includes specific characters. We have 2 upper and 2 lowercase, which converts the string to upper and lowercase. And then we have slice, which returns a specific part of the string. We have replace, which returns the same string but with different replacements for a specified part of the string. We have index of, which returns the index of characters within the string. And if there's not that character in the string, then it returns -1. And then we have char at, which returns the character of a string at a specific index. There's like so many of these built-in methods. So these are good ones to know, but just know that there are plenty more. Okay, let's talk about the DOM. So, what is the DOM? The DOM means the document object model. Okay, this is basically the browser's internal representation of all the elements on your web page. It's generated by HTML, and crucially, it is manipulated by JavaScript dynamically. Okay, so you can add, remove, change elements in real time using JavaScript. You can kind of think of the DOM like a tree. So you can see here, it starts at the root with the document, and then it branches out to the head and the body, and then to all of the nested HTML elements within your code. Okay, so with JavaScript, we can walk through this tree and modify anything in it. Okay, and if you want to inspect the DOM like we did before, you can do the right click and inspect, and you can see all of this code here is the representation of the DOM in HTML. Okay, so let's interact with the DOM some more with some code. If you want to follow along, you can open this link and you can see. So you can see this is some basic code. If we run it, it creates a web page. So this could be our DOM. So let's say we want to add some stuff. We can add like an H1 tag, give it an ID, call it hello, and we can write hello inside. We can also create a bunch of p tags. We can do this here, create a bunch of p tags, put some numbers in them. And you can see by doing this, we're changing the DOM. So if we run this, then we should see these new elements on our web page. Hello, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's some really basic things that we can add to our web page. And using JavaScript, we can modify these elements and do whatever we want with them. Okay, so how do we modify these elements? Okay, let's look at some functions that we can use. Okay. So the main three functions that we can do are adding, removing, and replacing. Okay. So first of all, we just need to access them. So to access them, we do um, document dot get element by ID and then the ID of that element. So you can, if you remember, I made that H1 tag and I gave it the ID hello. We can put hello inside of here and it gets us that element. Okay, if you want to get multiple elements, you can use these two. You can use get elements by class name or get elements by tag name. This returns an array of elements, um, basically all of the elements that are in this specific class or all the elements that have that specific tag. Okay, so we can see how we can manipulate these elements. So let's do an example. Okay, so you know that we created the hello tag. So first, let's get that tag, okay? So first, we always have to store it in a variable. We know we can go back, we did document.get element by ID, but we have to store this after accessing it in a variable so we can reuse it in the future, okay? So we like to make it a const. Let's call it greeting. And we're going to set it equal to document.get element by ID and then the ID. So you can, if we want to check back, we see our ID is hello. And then, so we set this equal to hello. And now, if we use greeting in our JavaScript code, it will be referencing this element right here. Okay? So let's say we want to change the color of it. Well, we could do this using JavaScript. We could do, let's say, greeting.style.color. Because that's equal to color. Let's do red. And if we run it, now our hello is red. Okay? Very nice. Now, let's say we want to change all of our p tags. Right now, they're just black. Let's say we want to change them to blue. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to store it in a variable. So we'll do const p's equals document. This time, we don't have a class. We don't have a ID. So we're going to use get elements by tag name. Okay, so we're going to do document dot get elements by tag name. This case, it's P. Make sure you don't forget those quotes. And then now we want to change them. So we can't just do it like this, like we did before, okay? Because if you remember, P's is actually going to be an array of elements. So we have to do a for loop. If you remember, if we want to iterate through an array easily, we can use the for of loop. So we're going to do for const p of p's. So now p will go to each element inside of p's. And then we do p dot style dot color equal blue. Okay? Run this, all of our p tags should also be blue. And now you can see they're blue. It also changed this one because this was a p tag, but you can see all of our p tags are blue now. Okay? Great. So go back here. Okay. Now, to create elements, if you want to create an element, we use document dot create element and then the tag name. So like, let's say we want to create a div, we use document dot create element, parentheses, div. And just remember, you always need those quotes, okay? So let's say we go back to our demo. Say we want to dynamically create something. Well, we can do, let's say we want to create another tag, okay? We can do create a paragraph element, and then we're going to do document dot create element P. So now we created a P tag, but that doesn't mean it's going to show up on our web page because there's nothing in it. So let's say we want to change the text content of our P tag. We can use this text content value. So we do paragraph L dot, we can use text content, and this changes whatever is in our element. So we can do equals, I am dynamically created. Now you're hoping it's going to show up on our webpage? No. Okay, so just because we create an element, we change the text content, doesn't mean it's going to show up on our webpage yet, but we're going to learn right now how to add it to a page, okay? So if we actually want to add it, we have to attach it to another element in our DOM as a child of that, okay? So you can see here, if we already have a parent element in our DOM, we can do that parent element dot append child, and then whatever we want to append to it inside those parentheses. So you can see here, we create a button. Let's say we want to append it to this div that we have inside of our DOM. We can do box dot append child and button, and then the button will appear on our web page. Okay, so let's do exactly that. Let's say we create a div inside of our HTML. Div, okay. And then let's give it an ID box. Okay, so let's say we want to append our paragraph element to this div. Well, first, let's create our variable for our container. This set equals document.getElement by ID. We called it box, so we box it here. Now this is our div. And now we can append or we can add our paragraph element to our container. So we do container.append child, and then we append paragraph out. Now, if we run this, you can see I am dynamically created is now finally on our web page because we did append child right here. Okay, move on. Okay, removing elements. Let's say we want to remove an element. Well, like append child, instead of append, we're doing remove. So we're going to do the parent of it. We're going to do dot remove child, and then we're going to do the name of the child. Okay. So and we can also replace elements. So let's say we want to replace an element with a new element. We can do parent.replace child, the new child as the first argument, and then the old child as the second argument. Okay? Now let's do a check-in. How would I add a paragraph element to the document body? So pause it if you need to think about it, think of your answer, and then we're gonna see the answer in 3, 2, 1. It's C. Okay, so the reason is because, so we, first of all, we know that the parent is gonna be the body. So we're gonna do document.body. If you remember, the function we use is append child, not append element. Okay, so we do append child, and then we want to create a new element. So inside here, we do document.create element, and we want it to be a p tag, so we do p. Okay, hope that makes sense. Okay, so here are some other useful properties of DOM elements. We can do dot class name, it gets the name of the class, so this would get the name some class. Dot ID gets the ID of the class. Dot text content returns the text contained within the element. If you remember, we can change the text content using that. Dot style returns the style property of that element. And dot value returns the value of an input. So like you can see input tag can have value, and then you can change that value using dot value. Okay, lastly today, we're going to talk about events. Okay, so events are very important because it allows you to to change things in your web page when the user does something specifically. Okay, so what is an event? An event is simply just something that happens on the web page that you can react to. For example, in the very beginning of our lecture, we were talking about how to delete something from our Gmail. If when you press the trash icon, that is an event that you can react to. The reaction was we delete the email. You can hover over the image, you can type something in a text box. All of these are elements that you can react to. Okay, for example, like I said, some are click, mouse over, mouse out. These are all things you can react to in your JavaScript. And then inputs is change, and change fires when the input's value changes. Okay, and there are dozens more. If you want to see, you can click this link in the slides, but we don't need to go over every single one. Okay. So, how do we actually handle these events? Well, we use event handlers to trigger actions when an event occurs on a specific target, okay? So, you can see here, if we want to add an event listener to a specific target, we can do the name of the target dot add event listener, then what the event is, and the function name that you want to call when that event happens. Okay, or yeah. Okay, so you can see here, we create a button, or we get the button from our doc, and then we add an event listener, and you can see here we add event listener, and it's basically saying when we click the button, call our do action function. Okay, so we create this function here, do action, and whenever we click that button, it'll call that function. Okay, so let's do a little demo. Okay, so let's create a button in our HTML, first of all. See, we have a button. Okay. And let's say press me. Let's give it an ID button. Okay. So we run it. We have this button. But you can see when I click it, it does nothing. Well, I want it to do something. So first, as always, I'm going to create a variable for a button. Okay. Button element. I'm going to get button, so document dot get element ID. We called it button. Okay, and then we do an event listener, okay? So first of all, we want to create a function that happens. So let's just create a function. We'll do say hello, okay? Say hello when we press this button. I'm gonna do alert, hello world. We'll see what this does soon. Now let's add an event listener, okay? So button L dot event listener, or sorry, add event listener. And now we're gonna put first what the event is. Well, we want it to occur when we click the button. Second one is what function we want to call when we click the button, which is going to be say hello. Okay. So now when we run it and we click the button, you can see this alert pops up because in our function we did alert hello world. So every time we press this, we get this little alert. Okay. Very nice. So now you know how to add events to your web page. Okay. Okay, so the event object. You are allowed to give event handler functions one parameter. So if you remember, you can see here our function do action had no parameter. You're allowed to have up to one, okay? Which the only parameter you're allowed to have is our event object, which gives you info about the event. Okay, this is helpful because let's say you want to change something about the target when the event happens. Well, then we need to access this target somehow. Well, we do that by doing event.target. And again, that gets us the element the event was fired on. So we can modify that element if we pass event in as a parameter. So you can see in this example, we do the same thing. We call do action when we click this button. But in this case, we pass an event as a parameter. So we do um, so that we can access the event.target. So you can see here, when we click the button, we change the target's background color to whatever this color is, okay? So if you ever want to modify the target of the event that occurred, you pass in the event object as your parameter, okay? Removing event listeners. Let's say you only want the action to happen once, okay? So let's say, for example, you only want the button to be clicked once. After you click the button once, you can't after you click the button once, um it no longer calls do action when you click it, okay? So you can see here we do target dot remove event listener, the name of the event, and then name of the function. So if you look here, when we call do action, it calls button.remove event listener, and then it removes the event. So like let's say you click the button, it console.logs button clicked. After that first initial click, once you click it again, nothing will happen because we removed the event listener from it. So the button only works once. Okay. Thank you for coming. I know that was a lot of information to process, but you can always go back through the video, watch it, look through the slides. This is some really important stuff, so I hope that made sense to you, and make sure to ask any questions on Ed if you have them. Okay? Thank you, and have a good day.